Good evening. The Indian Prime Minister hasn't visited Colombo since 2008, and the last bilateral meeting between the two top leaders of India and Sri Lanka was back in mid-2010. Sri Lanka and India have not been on the same page on many issues, especially after the fall of the Tamil Tigers in 2009 May. India wants substantial progress in reconciliation issues, especially the question of political rights of Tamils, before it commits a visit by Prime Minister Singh, even though a formal invitation has been forwarded by the Sri Lankan government. It is in this backdrop that the Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa begins what most analysts are calling his toughest and most challenging India visit yet. Although it started out as an unofficial visit to a Buddhist university in Sanchi, Madhya Pradesh, it quickly turned into an official visit with meetings scheduled with the President Pranab Mukherjee and the Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. Bilateral ties between India and Sri Lanka have been on the decline after India voted against the UNHRC resolution against Sri Lanka. At the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, according to his own account, was led to believe that India would abstain from such a vote. Indian officials to this day refute any miscommunications and claiming that enough signals were sent to convey that something drastic was on its way. The Lankan president, according to reports, is still hopeful that India will make amends. More on that later in the show. But what is even more worrying for the two countries is the issue of Lankan Tamils, and things came to a boil when a group of Lankan Tamil Christians were attacked after being mistaken for Sinhala pilgrims. Tamil Nadu CM J. Jayalalitha even went to the extent of sending the Lankan football team back to Sri Lanka in the backdrop of her consistent opposition to India training Lankan military personnel, saying that the island republic's forces had committed war crimes against Tamils. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, we take a look at Indo-Lanka relations post the UNHRC vote in the backdrop of the treatment of Tamils in Sri Lanka, and we ask our panel whether or not a reconciliation is at all possible. Joining me in the studio tonight will be Rajiv Sikri, former diplomat, former secretary in the MEA as well, also Ashok Behuria, senior research fellow of IDSA, and Mr. Murlidhar Reddy, deputy editor of The Hindu. I'd like to start the show, however, with Mr. Behuria, if I could, who's in the studio. Ashok, Indo-Lanka relations aren't experiencing the best of times right now, especially after the UNHRC vote. In that context, would you say that this unofficial/official visit now by Rajapaksa assumes even greater significance? And would you say that it's his most challenging trip across the Park Strait yet?
I think, if you look at Rajapaksa's tenure, right since he came to power, I think, he tried to engage India, I think, till the end of the war. And after that, he has been very adamant on especially on the reconciliation issue. And all efforts from the Indian side to push him towards finding a political solution to the ethnic problem in Sri Lanka has largely failed. And there you find that, there is a rise of Sinhalese nationalism in Sri Lanka. And especially after the UNHRC resolution, and when the Sri Lankan leadership was livid that India should not have voted against them, India has been very clear that Sri Lanka has to find a way of settling the ethnic issue. And in this context, and especially after this UNHRC resolution, President Rajapaksa's visit to India assumes special significance.
Right.
At least, certain issues will be, debated between the two leaders.
Absolutely. We'll come to those issues, but I want to come to Mr. Sikri and your views, sir, on how important this particular visit is. It started out as just a Buddhist university inauguration, but now Rajapaksa is meeting the president, he's meeting the prime minister, he's supposed to meet the prime minister even as we speak right now.
Oh, I think it's a very important visit, and I'm glad that he's here, because if there are misunderstandings between two countries, then you need to talk to each other to try and narrow the differences. And I think that it was a good move to invite him unofficially, informally for this Buddhist university inauguration, but the substantive elements are there. And I hope that he goes back with a much clearer sense of the extent of popular and particularly Tamil sentiment in India about the treatment of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. There are other issues also. I think after the UNHRC vote, we had, that was a signal to them. I think it took Rajapaksa a little bit by surprise.
So you do agree that he was taken aback by that decision?
Yes, but I think India needs to convey to him very clearly what the stakes are. And Rajapaksa, for all his bluster, cannot ignore India. It is too important a neighbor for him to just say, okay, I'll do exactly what I want. Hence, I think he's coming to India. There are so many other issues, the Chinese influence, the fishermen, and so forth.
Right.
But he must go back with a sense of what the public sentiment is. And just a few months ago, you had the parliamentary delegation which went there. That would have also convinced him that, this is not just the Tamils who are thinking in this way. This is the people across all of India.
Right. We will talk about all the issues you raised, the fishermen issue as well as the growing closeness of Sri Lanka to Pakistan and China. But just in a bit, I want to get Mr. Murlidhar Reddy's views on this. Murli, I want to talk about the center of the storm, so to say, the Lankan Tamil issue. But before that, we delve into that. I want to get a sense from you on what exactly is on Rajapaksa's mind. He maintains that he was led to believe that India would abstain from the UN vote. Indian officials still deny that, and they say that enough signals were sent to convey that something drastic was on the way. Is the Lankan president's stance of, let's call it a mock betrayal, is this just posturing by Rajapaksa? Because even he would have had some indication of what was to come on that particular UNHRC vote.
I don't think that's the right issue there, because I think this vote has come as a surprise to many who follow Sri Lanka within India as well, because India has never done this in the past, and that was one of the reasons why Colombo had believed that India will not vote against Sri Lanka.
Right, but would you say that, like Mr. Sikri right now just said, that it's a good thing that Rajapaksa is here? He would have had a sense when the parliamentary delegation went to Colombo and met those leaders there, that there is something amiss there. It's not just the Tamils, but the popular sentiment in India is something else. Would you say that his coming to New Delhi now, whether it's an official trip or an official trip, it's a sign of better things to come?
It's definitely going to help, at least in getting each other's point of view across. But I must say this, that there are very high-level delegations from Delhi that have been visiting Colombo from time to time after the military defeat of LTTE, and these messages are being conveyed repeatedly. But the Rajapaksa government has unfortunately not been paying any heed.
Right. I want to come to Ashok Behuria now, and before we go into a break, very quick reaction on this. Colombo and Rajapaksa in particular has been making it a point to make sure that India stays on its toes vis-a-vis Lanka. Recent statements by him, by the Lankan president, have thanked first Pakistan, then China on their support and help on vanquishing the tigers, so to say. Is that meant to just rile India and send a signal saying, look, we like you, we would prefer to be closest to you, but if you play hard to get, we have others. There are lots more fish in the sea.
Actually, after the war, and after the war was over in May 2009, from the Sri Lankan government side, there was a commitment made that we will work on this 13th Amendment, and we are looking towards a 13th Amendment plus kind of a solution. In fact, this is the only framework that was there in Sri Lanka to address the ethnic issue. But they have gone back and forth on this particular commitment of theirs, and so much so that in the back room the president would say that well, we are going to start from article the 13th Amendment, and in public he would say that we cannot abide by something which was imposed on us. So there has been a lot of duplicity as far as abiding by this commitment is concerned. Right. And right now India is ready to work towards a 13th Amendment plus kind of a settlement, but the commitment from Sri Lankan side is lacking, especially from the president's side, when he has he has a public mandate, and he has huge public mandate in fact, and he does have the capacity to drive home this point to the people of Sri Lanka that they need this urgently. But immediately after his re-election as the president, he has gone back on all his commitments.
Right.
So that is a point of worry for India at the moment. And I don't know how India will try to convince him about the need to come out with a solution.
We will get to that in a bit, but Mr. Sikri, do you agree that flirting with Beijing and Islamabad is just to rile up India?
I think when you are in a geographical position like Sri Lanka is vis-a-vis India, there is always a sense of insecurity, because it has no other neighbor. And it's perfectly normal for Sri Lanka to want to have some other friends so that to reduce the Indian dominance. I think we have to accept that there will be foreign powers who will be interested in Sri Lanka. We don't have the kind of deep pockets that China does. But I think we need to also convey quite clearly to Sri Lanka that there are certain red lines that should not be crossed.
And do you think that might be possible in this particular visit?
I certainly hope so.
Let's hope so.
What is the President and the Prime Minister going to talk to him
Absolutely,
about?
yeah.
This is a very important message that must be conveyed, that we have no problems with your being friends with everyone, but don't forget that we have our security interests.
Right.
And I don't think that for all the bravado that Rajapaksa or anyone in Sri Lanka has forgotten the 1987 intervention.
Right. It's very interesting you mentioned the 1987 intervention. We'll take a small break right now. We'll come back and we'll discuss a range of issues. First, of course, the violent protests against Rajapaksa coming into India, especially by Tamil Nadu parties, Vaiko's MDMK, of course, Jayalalitha's action of sending back the Sri Lankan football team as well. I want to go to Murlidhar Reddy after the break, but that's in a while. Take a short break, come back. Lots more to come on The Big Picture. Welcome back to The Big Picture. We're still discussing Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa's India visit right now. Let me go to Murli Reddy, who's still with us, who's joined us on the show. Murli, coming to the issue of reconciliation with the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. We've seen protests, extreme protests even in India. But at the diplomatic level, Murli, how far can India go really? And how much pressure can we really exert on Colombo to speed up the process of reconciliation with the ethnic Tamils in Lanka? We burnt our fingers badly in 1987, like Mr. Sikri just mentioned. So we surely don't want a repeat of that fiasco, do we?
There are two aspects to this. One is about the diplomatic leverage of India. The other is about the protests. I think India has enormous capacity or capability to influence or use its diplomacy on Sri Lanka, and I think those efforts are on. As far as street protests and sentiments are concerned, I feel that these are counterproductive. I would say that because people of Tamils in Sri Lanka have to live there, and this kind of stroking of feelings are not going to help. They are actually going to make their life more difficult.
Right. Would you agree with that? What Murli just said, that it would make exerting more pressure on Colombo would make the life of Tamils even more unbearable in Sri Lanka right now?
I think we have to remember that every time we stoke the Tamil feelings here, we also side by side ensure that there is a Sinhalese nationalist dimension which appears in Sri Lankan politics. I largely agree with the point that Mr. Reddy is making. But I'll go beyond that to say that, at the point wisdom consists in convincing Rajapaksa of the need to arrive at a political solution there. But I don't see it coming in any way. Because if you look at the Sri Lankan internal political dynamics, you find there is a sudden spot in the nationalist sentiments. And there is no leader at the moment, because if you look at the mainstream political parties with the
who can challenge
UNP and both the political parties, I think they're still engaged in a process of ethnic outbidding. Every party wants to convey that I am more nationalistic than the other. So in that situation, I find it very difficult to imagine that there will be any nationalist, any political consensus emerging in favor of a political solution. I think that is the crux of the problem, which is affecting the relationship between India and Pakistan, and that is really pushing Rajapaksa towards China and Pakistan. And Rajapaksa is trying to balance India with his kind of bettering of the relationship with
China,
China. And China is engaged in a lot of infrastructure projects and they have deep pockets, as Ambassador said. But Rajapaksa also understands that China can never replace India in Sri Lanka.
Right.
And he has to find a way of sorting it out with India.
I want to get Ambassador Sikri's views on this particular question. Is it going to be very difficult given the fact that Rajapaksa is now the national hero who vanquished the Tigers, and he has the mandate, like Ashok said, of the Sri Lanka, especially the Sinhala people there in Sri Lanka, and bowing down to international pressure, especially even worse, pressure from New Delhi to reconcile with the Tamils at New Delhi's pace. That would be seen as demeaning for a national hero right then. Are we then helpless in that sense? Because by the looks of it, Rajapaksa is going to take his own sweet time doing the whole reconciliation process with the Tamils.
I think we should not underestimate the impact of the UN Human Rights Commission vote, because that's an international vote. And that puts pressure. You have donors and others who are also involved in that process. And I don't think it serves Rajapaksa's political interest and Sri Lanka's national interest that it should be viewed internationally in a negative light, because it has so much going for it. There's tourism, there is investments which are there.
There's trade with India.
There's trade with India. But I mean, from an international perspective, I think Sri Lanka needs to open up, and it's got a lot going for it. But if Rajapaksa continues to follow narrowly nationalistic policies, if he wants to make Sri Lanka as a Sinhala country, without taking into account the interests of the minorities, then I think it will be trouble. Because, and this is actually a problem which all our neighbors have, that the minorities, particularly the minorities which have linkages, cross-border linkages with India, are always treated badly. See the Hindus in Pakistan, see the Tamils there, see the people of the Terai in Nepal. And that creates tensions. So Sri Lanka has to understand that it must have a more inclusive polity if it is to be stable. And while maybe there's not much we can do about it, but if there is widespread anti-Sri Lanka sentiment or Sinhala sentiment in Tamil Nadu, then I think it does create complications, because how do you know that 5-10 years down the line there won't be another LTTE redux?
Right. I want to get Murli on this. Murli, you heard what Master Sikri had to say. Given the fact that Rajapaksa is now a national hero in Sri Lanka, do you think he'll be an extremely tough nut to crack? And like Ambassador Sikri said, he must realize that narrowly nationalistic policies are going to harm relations, not just with India, but also the international community.
Yeah, I entirely agree with him. He's a seasoned diplomat. The point that he is making, that if he continues to, or if the community that he thinks he represents, that the Sinhalese community, is championing their cause, he will certainly pave way for another LTTE in the next maybe 10 to 20 or 30 years to come.
Right. Ashok, what are your views on the political Tamil opposition in Sri Lanka right now? The TNA, the Tamil National Alliance, is perhaps the only sizable party there, a political force there, and they haven't really been able to counter Rajapaksa and his stature or his mandate as such. With the LTTE gone, that's the only Tamil voice left. What is the future of that sizable Lankan Tamil populations who belong to former Tamil tiger strongholds like Jaffna or there's another one called Kilinochi. Kilinochi, I think, is the place. Every day there are reports of Lankan army harassing these people, and Lankan army checkposts, like they try to prey on these people. What is the future of these Lankan Tamils? Would early elections in those areas like Jaffna and Kilinochi be, do you consider that to be a solution at all?
In fact, if you look at the local bodies elections, the TNA has won hands down there. So that suggests, the people of that region are still, opposed to the central government in Colombo, and they are not happy with the way things are being done in their areas by the central government in Colombo. In that sense, I think there are a lot of antipathy now coming to the fore. And I would entirely agree with Ambassador Sikri and Mr. Reddy that maybe a decade hence you will find the LTT re-emerging on the scene, if their genuine concerns are left unaddressed. But coming back to the Tamil sentiments in Tamil Nadu, I would say at the moment they're latching onto this UNHRC resolution and the international hue and cry over the human rights crimes that have been committed by the Sri Lankan forces. But I would say that this is more political than real. I think there you have all these political actors, Vaiko, Nedumaran, and you have Jayalalitha, you have Karunanidhi. I think there is a political battle cooking there. They are all trying to address the issue because they want to ensure that all the electoral sympathies stay with their their parties.
Just statewide political posturing.
I think there is an element of pressurizing the central government to do something about the Tamil political situation in Sri Lanka. But I would say that it's not, there is no traction to what they are doing at the moment. Rather, they are trying to ensure that the nationalist sentiments in Sri Lanka comes to the fore, and the Sri Lankan Tamils suffer much more than they are suffering at the moment.
Right. Reddy, very quickly, if you can, before we go into a break, you heard what Ashok Behuria just said. He said that the local body elections, the TNA won hands down, and that shows really that there is still a hard anti-government sentiment there. But even if there are early elections there, Rajapaksa has played sort of a masterstroke by getting the Muslims and other Sinhala-speaking people who had left because of the Tamil Tigers back to those places like Jaffna and Kilinochchi and other tiger-infested areas. Hasn't Rajapaksa strengthened his hand there and ensure that even if early elections are held there, that would ultimately go the pro-government way?
No, that's not possible at all. See, the Muslims that one is talking about 100,000 Muslims were driven out by LTT. They were just given 24-hour notice, and they are all Tamils. These Muslims are all Tamils. Very few Sinhalese were there in the northern province. They are there, some of them are there in eastern province. So now there is an effort to get back these Tamil Muslims to Jaffna. But even there, I don't think there has been much progress.
Right, but do you think early elections there in the northern provinces would be an ideal solution to start at least the reconciliation process?
Yeah, it can be a beginning, because at least there will be a provincial government there, even if it has very, very small, little powers.
Right. On that note, Murli, we'll take a break. We'll come back after the break and we'll get our closing arguments and the road ahead for Indo-Lankan ties. Don't go anywhere. Keep watching The Big Picture on Rajya Television. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa is in India. It started out as an unofficial trip, became an official trip overnight. He met President Pranab Mukherjee today, also is scheduled to meet the Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. Lots of issues are expected to be discussed today. The issue of Lankan Tamils and their reconciliation as well. The attacks on pilgrims of Sinhala origin, or what they thought were pilgrims of Sinhala origin, will obviously be discussed as well. Ambassador Sikri, how should New Delhi play this one out? While not appearing to be following what one would call coercive diplomacy, and I'm asking you this because you're a former diplomat, but also ensuring that the Tamils in Sri Lanka and the Tamil reconciliation issue is sort of expedited by Rajapaksa's government. Is flourishing trade going to be key, because Sri Lanka, Colombo and New Delhi would want to stress on that as well?
No, trade is important, but it's not the most important element in our relationship. I think, having said that, I think Sri Lanka is still our largest trading partner in South Asia. We do have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and we wanted to go on to the next stage, a little advanced level, but the government in Sri Lanka is reluctant. I think we should be a little pushing Sri Lanka a little more on the economic side, because it is in our interest, and I hope in Sri Lanka's interest also, that the economies are a little more integrated, because that would create incentive on both sides to have a more normal relationship. At the same time, I do believe that we need to be very firm in conveying to Sri Lanka the depth of sentiment about Tamils and explain that this is a long-term problem. We must explain our security concerns, that we certainly do not expect Sri Lanka to do anything that would be viewed as prejudicial to India's security. And, the other things are little pinpricks, the fishermen, then you have the Sri Lankan protests over Kudam Kulam, stuff like that. I think those can be handled.
Minor.
But from a national point of view, these are the big issues. That
Right. Murli, if I can come to you very quickly, how do you see New Delhi playing this one out? Do you think coercive diplomacy would be the absolute wrong way to go? But like Ambassador Sikri said, we have to convince them and convey to them the firmness in our demand that the Lankan Tamils, that issue needs to be addressed right away.
Absolutely right. I would only amend it as nuanced coercive diplomacy, because the more we try and speak in public, the more posturing will be there from these hardcore nationalists in Sri Lanka. So it will not serve any purpose just to be saying it loudly. I think we have to say it firmly but quietly.
But do you see, Murli, do you see Mahinda Rajapaksa and the reputation he has coming midway and meeting us along the way? Do you see him relenting at all?
As Sikri Saab said, India cannot be ignored by Colombo under any circumstance, and he will realize sooner than later.
Right. Last word on the show, very quickly, Ashok, if you want to add a bit to that.
I think we'll have to tell Mr. Rajapaksa very firmly and very clearly that the patience on our side is running out, that the patience on the Tamils in Sri Lanka is running out, and the window of opportunity that he had after 2009 May is fast shutting down. And in this background, he has to cook up something. He has to find out a way of addressing this central issue, which is going to affect the relationship between the two countries, and which is going to affect peace and stability of the Sri Lankan state.
Absolutely. On that note, we must end the show. I must thank all my guests who joined us. Murlidhar, Reddy, thank you so much for joining us on The Big Picture. Ashok Behuria, as well as Ambassador Sikri, thank you so much for coming. Nuanced coercive diplomacy, like Murli said, I think was the key takeaway today from this discussion. Mahinda Rajapaksa is still in India. He has meetings scheduled with the Prime Minister. Of course, like my panelists, think that nuanced coercive diplomacy, we must convey to Sri Lanka, to Colombo, and to President Rajapaksa that the Lankan Tamil issue, of course, assumes greater significance not just for the two countries but also for the region. That's all the time we have on The Big Picture tonight. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.